Welcome to PharmaTelevision News Review here in London. On this show, I have a group of communications experts in the pharmaceutical and biotech field. Welcome. Sue, you're a managing partner at College Hill. Your experience goes way back in communications in the pharmaceutical and biotech field. Why is communication so important in any field, in fact, and why is it important for any company to have a strong communications policy?
Thank you. I think, first of all, this industry, biotech and pharmaceuticals, has a particular need to communicate trust. It's an industry where billions of dollars are invested over 10, 15 years before a drug even gets to market. And when it does, that has a big effect on people's healthcare and expectations. So, number one, it's about trust, I think, and therefore communications is really important to setting that trust agenda with all audiences with whom a company may need to communicate. I think second to that is expectations. You're setting an agenda of trust, and the expectation is that you will be developing a drug for the future. So in this industry, we're selling hopes and dreams for the future, and therefore managing expectations through news flow, through brand management, through all forms of communication is really, really important. And finally, I think it's a matter for every company to have their own position and their own seat at the table. So it's about awareness, perception, creating a position for yourself as a company. So all of those things, really, trust, perception and expectations all play a role, and communications is vital to all of those. Okay.
So when it comes to you, Sharon, you're a senior communications manager at Roche Partnering. From Roche's point of view, where does communication at a partnering level fit? How important is it?
Well, I think I'll underline a lot of what Sue has just said in terms of, the awareness, the perception, the trust that needs to be built in us, if you like, by the partner. And then I think also, from our point of view, visibility is very important. The ability to be able to differentiate between other companies. So that all plays a role. I think we need to really, as I said before, differentiate. We need to be visible. We need to manage expectations, and we really need to be on the radar screen of any potential partners, so that we can develop those alliances.
Okay, and Katja, for you, similar role to Sharon, but maybe my question is slightly different in the sense that going back to this concept of managing expectations and perception. I mean, obviously it's important in the field of partnering itself that ultimately there's both success and failure. So how do you manage for both of those?
Well, I think in terms of managing expectations, I think it's very important that you're aligned internally and externally with the deliverables that you're trying to communicate. So I think it's understanding that partnering audience, what their needs are, and how you can closely, collaborate with those types of companies. So at AstraZeneca, we've been working hard to really align our internal organisational behaviour so that it is externally focused and looking at partnering opportunities and bringing opportunities in from the outside. Because in the past, I think pharma in general has been criticised for being perhaps too internally focused, and there's kind of a not invented here syndrome. So I think it's important to ensure that you're actually focusing those efforts on being an effective partnering organisation.
Sure, but I suppose your role has just been recent. You've been there just over a year now.
That's
right.
Can
you see the effect?
I certainly noticed a big change in the organisation. There's been a lot of things put into place recently with Martin McKay. He was very actively focused on mobilising the R&D organisation to ensure that they're actually out there looking for opportunities and actually on a seat at the table when it comes to evaluating those opportunities very early on, so that we can be more responsive more quickly at sort of feeding back to companies whether an opportunity is of interest or not. And obviously that's key for biotech companies to know early on. It's better for them to get a quick no than actually being dragged along for a period of time if there isn't a strategic fit with the pharmaceutical companies. So.
And Nicole, you work with some of the biotech companies. These are obviously the smaller companies who may not have the same resources as a large pharmaceutical company, for example. So how important from a biotech perspective, and where should they place the emphasis on communication?
Well, I think for biotech companies it's very important, and if we're talking about partnering from the sort of other side to the work that Katja and Sharon are doing, it's very important for the biotechnology companies to be seen as, a credible potential partner. And obviously the data speaks for itself, but quite often we see with some of the companies that actually just by communicating better and in different ways, they can actually be regarded as more highly by the potential partners. We have examples of companies where it was only by raising their profile through perhaps some data and then getting a profile piece in the trade media that they were picked up by a potential pharma partner who actually didn't know they existed before. So I think it's not about flashing loads of money around and you know, spending lots on websites and fancy things. I think it's really about, you know, communicating your objectives and getting out there and showing yourself as a credible partner. And that may be news flow, it may be media relations, it may be doing something like this, PharmaTV, it may be, you know, through branding work. But I think quite often it's important for those biotech companies to really be seen as credible partners for the pharmaceutical companies they want to work with. And indeed, you know, beyond partnerships, it may be that they want to raise money, it may be that they want an exit, you know, all those different objectives can be supported through communications.
Right. I suppose, Sue, that brings us onto a question about why a company should choose a consultancy. I suppose part of that also relates to the overall communication strategy. So how important is developing the strategy, and how does that then lead to all the various broader communication channels that can be opened up?
I mean, first of all, a company has to decide for itself its own business objectives. And I think, as Nicole said, communications can be used to support, you know, all many of those. So the strategy will derive, first of all, from the business objectives. Then the company itself has to decide how it wants to communicate, who's going to be the spokespeople. So you know, in forming any relationship with a consultancy, you cannot outsource communication, because communication is everything that a company does, everything every employee does, everything the CEO does and says, what the website looks like, etc. But once the company has got its own personality and strategy in place, then I think the role that a consultancy can play is you know, maybe threefold. First of all, it might just be, you know, resources and skills. You know, if you need a website, you probably don't have a web programmer. So, you know, you can outsource resources and skills. Then I think there's an outsourcing of contacts and experience. And, you know, you can only build up so much in-house, whereas if you go to a consultancy, you might be tapping into, you know, 20 people's expertise over 25 years, and you're going to get a lot more expertise and contacts that way. And I think finally, you get that external perspective that, you know, if you've got a good message internally and a good position that you want to create, you can get a little bit, you know, protective of that internal vision. And what you need is the wider perspective. And I think a consultant can come in from the outside and perhaps put some of those external perspectives onto the communication to help build a sort of a rounded and believable strategy that really then fits into the whole.
Okay. And I suppose then, Sharon, the question really is, I suppose from a partnering perspective, your one line of communication coming out, but it comes back to the overall corporate strategy for communication within Roche. So how does that actually work for you within your own organisation?
Within the company overall, I think from a strategic point of view, then that's done internally from a corporate communications point of view. Mm-hmm. If we look at partnering now, we like to go outside to consultancies because, of course, they've got the experience of working with other partners and partnering organisations, whereas anybody else within the existing company don't have that breadth of experience. So certainly from that point of view, it's useful to go externally because they've got that experience with other partners or potential partners. Okay. But indeed, in other divisions of Roche, or let's say other functions within Roche, we may find that we'll use a consultancy who's got a specific experience. I mean, it may be that you want some information on some content in strategy, for instance, but you may want content on a specific thing, like Sue mentioned about a website, for instance. You may not have that internal experience, or it may be that you're looking at a specific branding problem to solve, and then you may need an external consultancy. So it really depends. It's on a case by case level. Okay.
Katja, one of the things that's happened recently is the emergence of social media as a means to communicate, and often it's quite tempting because it's relatively accessible. From an AstraZeneca point of view, and I'm looking at from a partnering perspective, because obviously there are websites like LinkedIn, but there are also other websites like Twitter, obviously, and Facebook. What sort of opportunity exists with social media, and what are the obstacles that you see from a corporate point of view in terms of trying to handle this new wave of social media?
I mean, of course, social media has a huge role to play in the digital age that we live in, and it's really, you know, making the most of that opportunity. But clearly, in the pharmaceutical industry, it's a highly regulated industry, so you know we have to be very controlled in terms of what we can tweet about, for example, or what we want to communicate about. But it does have its place. Specifically at conferences, for example, we were at Bio recently, and we were one of the most buzzed about organisations, mainly because we were tweeting news and new brochures and new website content that we wanted to make, sort of raise the visibility of at a specific event where we knew there'd be lots of appropriate people present and partners present. So it's using it in the right place and the right context, but that goes for the communication strategy overall. It's maximising the effect at points in time when it makes sense. But I think it also varies depending on whether you're pharma or biotech, because clearly biotech companies are small organisations and might not have the same amount of resource that they can dedicate to digital and social media. So they have to be aware of ensuring that they have a long-term strategy in place, and they're not just sort of occasionally putting a tweet or not responding to a blog or whatever they decided to do from a social media perspective, because the worst part of it is not, you know, following through and being credible. So I think that's probably a point too.
I think that's really interesting, Katja, and I completely agree. I think, you know, there's far too many companies in the past have tried to engage in social media, just kind of tick the box and say we're doing it, rather than those examples you gave where it's actually real and it's serving a purpose. It's a two-way communication, so it's slightly different from, say, a press release or something, but it is a vehicle for communicating your messages, just as you described.
Yeah.
So, but I suppose, Nicole, from your point of view, where you're representing, let's say, a smaller biotech company, they may be tempted because they perceive that as a cheaper alternative to, you know, more expensive and probably more labour-intensive other forms of communication. Do you recommend this to your
I think
clients?
it really comes down to, again, as we've said, what are your objectives as an organisation, and what tools do you have, communications tools and others, that you can then use to meet those objectives. So I wouldn't recommend a company, you know, small or large, just, you know, jump on a social media bandwagon for the sake of it. I think it's part of a programme of communications. I think where it makes sense, for example, as Katja described, they used it at a conference and so on, where you want to engage with different types of people, different stakeholders in a sort of two-way communication. I think it's great. Yes, it's very regulated, so that's something we need to be careful of. But we've got some clients of ours, pharma, biotech, VCs, who are very prolific on the sort of tweeting and social media side. So I think it can work, but it has to be part of a programme, and it has to be thought through the same way as any other communication tool would be.
And I'd like to pick up on a point there. It's certainly not cheaper. It takes up a lot of time. I think that one of the things to consider if you're doing social media and tweeting is you can't start and then stop. So you have to monitor, you have to know what's being said in the external environment. That takes up a lot of time. Then you have to decide who's going to, you know, engage, how, and how that's going to be controlled, you know, sign-off procedures, all sorts of things. So it's a very time-consuming means of communication, and I think companies shouldn't underestimate when going into it the amount of time that it will take either them or whoever they might employ to keep up the effort to make it effective.
Right.
There's certainly been a lot of buzz about it and that sort of thing, and I mean, I think what's important is that everybody participates in a certain shape or form in social media, but I think you also, what was being said before by the rest of the panel, obviously the resources shouldn't be missed, because it does take a lot of time. If there's a blog or a tweet, there needs to be a response to that, and a timely response. So I think that shouldn't be underestimated.
Okay. So when it comes to you, Sharon, you're from your experience, what is the tool that you prefer to use at Roche to communicate?
I mean, I can't say that you've got one preferred tool. I think you've really got to see it as an integrated form of communications, and you have to be seen to be using all of the channels. We've got all the channels at our disposal, and I think it's important to be seen to use them and to use them effectively. And it depends, again, on your target audience. There are some of your audience, a lot of the journalists and analysts, they're very keen on the standard, classical, traditional press releases they would like to use. And others, you know, perhaps a younger generation might be more into tweets or social media or blogs. So you really need to have a good mix of different things.
Right.
I think I would add to that also. It's about what your objective is, exactly as Sharon was saying. But so, for example, if you want to make your partnering team appear more accessible and bring their personalities out, in terms of perhaps trying to differentiate yourself from some of your peers, and things like video, like PharmaTV, for example, plays a good role. And there are other means depending on what your objective is exactly.
So Sharon, when it comes to communication at a partnering level, I suppose you've got lots of different partners. How do you make sure that there is a reasonable distribution of information flow for each of those partners?
Well, what we do, specifically in Roche Partnering, we have a global account director aligned to each of the different partners. And in those cases, they are in constant contact with the partner to find out about what is on the horizon. And then from a communications point of view, we try and plan that so we're ahead of the game. We know what the partnering organisation has to communicate. We know what we want to communicate. We align ourselves very much with them. We talk with them on a regular basis. We're prepared for different instances. It might be a press release that we need to bring out because we've got some great news to announce, or on the other side of things, we've got some of the partners have conferences or annual reports, and whatever they're saying about Roche, or indeed what we're saying about them in our annual report, needs to be aligned. So we do keep in very close contact, and in any partnership, there's very much a working together attitude. We like to give our partner a seat at the table, and that's an equal seat to us. So all communications is worked on together, and I think that's a really important part of the mix.
Now, Katja, people often think of communication as an external exercise. Yeah. How important is internal communication?
Good question. I think for myself, having worked for sort of 12 odd years before that in a consultancy and for smaller companies, I think the biggest challenge for me going into AZ, which is a 60,000 person organisation, a huge organisation, is the importance played by internal communications. There's whole teams just dedicated to internal comms, particularly in R&D. And it's a key element of the communication. Essentially, you want your organisational behaviour to reflect what you're trying to achieve externally. So if AZ's one of its core business strategies at the moment is to partner, then we need the behaviours of the organisation to mirror those, because there's no point in going out there and saying, we're the partner of choice, come partner with us, and then the employees aren't behaving in the same way. For example, if we're trying to be more responsive, we're setting performance measures in place so that actually employees are motivated and incentivized to behave in that way. So there's all sorts of things you can do in terms of internal communications and making sure that you're actually behaving as an effective partner organisation. We touched on it earlier, not invented here syndrome. Sure. How to engage the R&D organisation with partnering. So it's not just a quick fix; it's a long-term strategy. So it has a key role to play.
Okay, Nicole, just a question for you on the biotech. I suppose one of the dangers that biotech companies have is that they overinflate their position. So how important is aligning the communication strategy for a biotech in that perspective?
Well, obviously it's really important. I think there's often a tendency to communicate very, very positive news. I think it's important that you put your best show on, and I think communications can help to a certain extent, but they're not going to cover up anything that's there. So I think communications are there to support what's already there, rather than invent and create something that isn't.
I suppose, Sue, with your experience in the industry, what can go wrong, and have you any examples of when things can be done a lot better, let's say, when it comes to communication?
It comes back to my initial points of trust and expectation management. So we work in an industry where clinical trials will fail. There will be side effects of drugs. So at a basic level, that isn't a measure of a company's success or failure per se. So I think there's plenty of things that we can prepare for in terms of what might go wrong. Look ahead, make sure you're planned, make sure you've thought about third parties in that mix as well. If if a trial doesn't perhaps perform how you might hope it had, then there are external experts in that field that you may have built up relationships with who can comment on why it might have failed. And it isn't negative per se, it's about putting it into the bigger picture. Being a member of a trade association, if things are tricky and it might have an impact on the whole industry, then being able to bring in a trade association to work alongside you and make a comment alongside you. And I think we have to remember, we work in an area of right at the forefront of science and discovery, and that's a real challenge when you are communicating into a knowledge vacuum. And I worked many years ago on the announcement of Dolly the sheep, and we were communicating about cloning, and that was something that had been only a science fiction possibility. And to think about all the stakeholders and how to communicate, taking a position, what were you going to comment on, what weren't you going to comment on, needs a lot of forethought. So think ahead, I think, is the key message there. Okay,
Sue, Sharon, Katja and Nicole, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Thank you.